Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin, and welcome to the Cosmic Perspective. On today's episode, I have my friend Johnny come through, and we debate free will and determinism. And on this podcast, I honestly felt like I was the guest, and he was the host, because he certainly was the one asking the questions for me here. But I think it's a really interesting conversation, and it's one that, as the conversation went on, I think I started to figure out where I really fell on the spectrum, and at first I certainly was a little thrown off by his questions. I wasn't as prepared as he was with what he wanted to talk about. But I think you guys will really enjoy it. Johnny's a really cool guy, somebody who certainly has an interesting perspective, and I think he makes some interesting points for his case, and I hope that I make some for mine as well. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the podcast. Thank you, Johnny, for joining me here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, dude, I found that the intro is always the weird part. I'm like, all right, let's just get into the conversation.
All right. Since that's the case, I'm here today to sort of discuss one or two things, but it could really be one thing. It's the idea of free will versus determinism. And I wanted to call upon a few literary pieces that have touched on this. One of the reasons I brought this up as a topic is because, personally, I feel like this is one of the few questions that really matter. And whenever it's brought up to people, a lot of people don't really like to go there because either they find out what they do believe in, or they find out that they're scared of believing in something else.
So it's the fear of maybe not being in as much control as they think they are?
I think so. And
Yeah.
what are the implications of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought to start, we could sort of give a definition on free will and determinism.
Yeah.
I think the latter is something that isn't quite touched in culture, right? We know what free will is. It kind of has its own definition in that sense. Determinism, though, it's one of those isms that not many people may have studied, right? And I like to define it as determinism is that every moment that has happened, will happen, is on a set course. Everything is determined. That whether a moment takes place 5 years from now or 100 billion years from now, that exact moment is set.
Do you subscribe to that?
I do. Now,
Okay.
I also have this funny hope, this funny wish, and this wish is that it isn't true, in my mind, that this is perhaps just a belief and not a conviction. I always like to keep the other side open. So in terms of this question between free will and determinism, I may be biased, but it doesn't mean I'm closed off to one field of thought.
That's fair. Because I've heard this question asked a lot on like Sam Harris's podcast, and he loves to talk about the difference between free will and determinism. He believes we don't have free will. He believes that a lot of the things that we end up doing are really products of pieces of information that we are not consciously aware of, yet it is being processed, right? So things happening in our situation, in our environment that affect our decisions despite us not actually being conscious that it's affecting our decisions.
I see.
And I mean, I would say I subscribe to that aspect that there are a lot of things that I think do influence us, and I'm not convinced that we do have free will. But that being said, I do feel like when you make a decision, you feel like you're making it,
right?
You know, and I think there is some degree of being able to take control without maybe the larger narrative might be that, well, yeah, that you were going to do that every single time, all these times that this is played out in the universe. So it's possible that, that there's no decision, but I think even the illusion of free will is strong enough for you to essentially manifest your own destiny on some level, even if it's predetermined.
Right. And I would even say that in terms of trying to define free will, what you were mentioning as a decision, right? If there's a decision to be made, you have a choice, and your choice can choose, right? I'm with you that I just haven't heard a argument that uses so much logic and reason to argue for the existence of free will, whether it's on a spectrum, which I don't think it's on a spectrum. I think it's really binary, right? It either exists or it doesn't.
Yeah.
Whether it exists a little bit, hey, that's okay with me. And I think to start, in terms of a literary piece that I have for you that I think touched on this, which many people, when they've studied this book, they may have not noticed this. It's Hamlet, actually. So Hamlet, for those who may forget their Shakespeare, right? A son's father is killed. His father's ghost visits him, says that his uncle did it. His uncle married his mom right after, right? Hamlet is really pissed off, and he knows that his uncle did it. He's very suspect. And his plan is, I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to act mad so that no one really knows that I know, but I'm going to set up little things to kind of poke at them, whether it's drawing up a play where the king dies from ear poison, to just little jabs at his family members. It's quite a tragedy, right? In Shakespeare, either everyone gets married or everyone dies.
Yep.
This time, everyone dies. Spoiler alert. And
in case you didn't know.
Yeah. I think that spoiler's been out there for a while.
Yeah. Definitely longer than our lifetimes.
One of the things, before I even trying to reproduce this sonnet, or soliloquy, I should say, is that a lot of nouveau plays with Hamlet will have Hamlet dressed in all black. They'll have him be very emotional, right? And a couple things I like to think of. The first line of the play is "Who's there?" and the last line of the play is silence when he's dead, right? So I like to think of Hamlet as consciousness itself, whether it's scripted in determinism or unscripted in a sort of free will scenario. Throughout the play, Hamlet's a super moody teen. His dad just died. He's thinking about life and death and what it means to really be alive. And the soliloquy says this. I'm sure you've heard it before, and we can dissect some of the lines a little bit further.
Yeah, I'd like to.
I'll do my best Shakespearean accent. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and, by opposing them, end them? To die, no, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. So, in terms of the lines that I like to pick out on this, and before we get into this, a lot of classical interpretation of this is whether to live or whether to die. I like to think of this as whether or not to subscribe to free will and truly live your life believing you have control over it, or to sort of surrender. And those lines are whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So for me, if you're suffering what life throws at you, but you're surrendering to it, that would almost be determinism in a sense. or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So perhaps he questions whether there is a choice to not accept what you might be experiencing and then actually oppose them and say, this doesn't coincide into what I want, so I'm going to try and really make a difference in what I do.
Interesting. Okay. I'd never heard of it that way before. So that is a new take on it. But that does make sense when you put that filter over it. And yeah, I guess the real question is, I think there is something to surrendering. But does surrendering mean you give up the concept in your own mind of free will? Because I think there are some levels where you might surrender to the universe, so to speak, by being like, well, this thing happened because it's now in the past, right? And moving forward, I can use that as a jumping off point for a future angle or future direction that I can take. So something bad happens to me and I'm like, all right, well, it happened. I'm going to accept that and trust in the process, trust in the universe, and take it maybe a different direction. I don't think that necessarily fully gives up free will just by that definition alone. Now, you might give it up in another context, but I think just purely trusting in the universe and accepting what's been given to you to some degree is, I think, a healthy thing to do, because once it's in the past, there's nothing you can do about it. So you might as well take that information and try to morph it to your advantage moving forward to either avoid a situation like that again, or if it's a good thing, to try to reproduce that again in some other manner.
Interesting. What do you think about fate?
What do I think about fate? I think fate is something that people use as a word without necessarily understanding the definition.
So how would you define fate?
I feel like there's a few definitions to fate.
What's yours? We can look up the Merriam-Webster definition, but I mean, they update that all the time.
I guess my version of fate would be something that happens to you in the way you look at it in retrospect.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? Like, oh, that's your fate. Well, it was your fate because it happened. Not necessarily like, oh, this was always my fate. This was always going to be. But then again, it goes into the question of free will and determinism, right? Of like, well, what do you think arrived at that particular situation that you ran into?
That's interesting. I haven't heard a definition that looked at it in excuse me, in the past. I always think of fate as something in the future.
It's your future, yeah.
Where you said, this is your fate. If someone says this is your fate, I would think, oh,
they're trying to prognosticate.
Yeah, this is going to happen later on. Someone's looked into their crystal ball and said, oh, you're going to lose a lot of money, or like you're going to get a flat tire on that Tuesday morning.
I don't subscribe to that. I don't know. I don't think anybody can tell me what my future is going to be. I think I can steer things in certain directions based off of what's happening to me, and how much of that I'm actually in control of, I don't know.
Ooh, okay.
You know, I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that I control everything, right? I really don't. And in fact, certain things I specifically surrender my control to the process or to the things that are happening to me. But then I try to take that and morph it into how then I approach future scenarios.
It sounds like even the choice of surrendering, though, gives you that sort of choice.
Yeah. Like I said, I don't subscribe to it being a choice as much as it could just be an illusion. But it certainly feels like I'm making decisions, even if I don't necessarily fully believe that I actually have free will. You know, I've had some moments, specifically with psilocybin, where I saw the timeline of my life. I saw that I've lived this life over and over and over again. So to some degree, I kind of do believe in that it's cyclical and that this has continued to happen. And maybe each time it happens, I'm able to make slight changes in how it played out from the last time, but more or less it follows a similar course.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a lot of nice theories on deja vu then.
Well, actually, deja vu, I believe, is a genuine misfiring of your brain. But you know what? It could be that it's you remembering parts of your past life. But I don't believe necessarily in the idea that I'm reincarnated as a dog as much as it would be maybe I'm more reincarnated as myself over and over and over again.
That'd be pretty nice, honestly. I wouldn't want to be a dog.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think there's some cool things about being a dog, but yeah. I like being a human. I like being conscious of whatever the hell we are, wherever the hell we are. It's not like we know anything, but at least we're like somewhat aware that there's something.
That's true. Yeah.
The happening, as Alan Watts would call it.
Ooh, I like that. I like to think of it as a still point of awareness where perhaps maybe you aren't really in control, but you're aware that you're at least experiencing or observing whatever is happening to you. One other quote I have for you, just to sort of chug this along. And because I like that you're not a definitive person on these two sides of the table. And, you know, as discussed earlier, I don't want to have this one-sided table. I sort of like having something on the other side just to open it up, right? There's one book I recently finished. It's called Shantaram. It's about an Australian man that broke out of prison in Australia and moved to Bombay, India. And he lived there for over a decade, lived in the slums. Amazing story. And highly recommended also, in case you're looking for an epic. Towards the end, he has a couple final words to say. And now, this is actually more of an autobiography, if anything. The man who wrote it actually lived this. And he's had crazy experiences happen to him. I think living in poverty for a week teaches you more than living in luxury for a lifetime. So to live in the slums for years teaches you a couple life lessons.
I like that quote.
Right?
That quote's awesome. Yeah, a week in poverty is more than a lifetime in riches.
That's
I like that.
so true.
Yeah.
He says, I'll jump into the quote. He'd been trying to tell me that every human has the power to transform its fate. I'd always thought that fate was something unchangeable, fixed for every one of us at birth, and as constant as the circuit of the stars. But I suddenly realized that life is stranger and more beautiful than that. The truth is that no matter what kind of game you find yourself in, no matter how good or bad the luck, you can change your life completely with a single thought or a single act of love.
I like that a lot. Yeah. I would say, if anything, I subscribe more to that.
Right.
For sure. Yeah.
So now, one of the reasons I bring up this book is because I'll always ask different friends, I say, what is your best argument for free will? And what's kind of ironic, or maybe it's a lesson to be learned, is that every single one of them recommends a book. They can't really put it in some sort of reasonable proof, right? They're like, nope, you have to read this 900-page book to understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And that alone I really like too. That, to me, is a lifeline of the free will argument, that perhaps there is some sort of glimmer of a choice to choose an act of love or kindness, right? Where we're in so many scenarios that if we truly did follow our primal instinct to simply survive, there may not be as many loving instances of philanthropy or kindness between other people. And that, I think, goes into human values in itself. Why do we care for others if we're supposed to be rationalized creatures for ourselves? And if we're really letting our brains fire off their mechanist wirings, right? Their electronic synapses, instead of consciously and in control of what we're thinking and how we're feeling, it's kind of doesn't make sense in a way. Either it says that perhaps our wiring isn't as rational as we thought, and that we're irrational, and that we are perhaps programmed to do these irrational things like love. And maybe if we do listen to that or do subscribe to that, it carries it's on its own path of loveness.
Okay. Yeah, I got a couple things from that. So I guess one of the first things that comes to mind is that the doors of opportunity that are constantly being opened and closed in any given scenario that you have in every day. What would be something that makes you consciously choosing to go through these doors, and which could alter your life forever? One exchange with a person could end up being that person becomes your best friend and ends up doing some awesome things with them. How much of that would be that you're consciously actually picking, you notice the opportunity and you see it and you seize it, versus just you are always going to see it and seize it, like that there was no other option, even though it's the illusion of choice. And it's the same way that when you think about technology and all of the things that we have, right? We have the illusion of choice and content and information, but the reality is there's not a lot of choice at all. You're gently guided in all these directions. You search something on Google, it's going to just confirm whatever the hell you just searched. And I think to some degree, the universe has its own form of that, right? Its own algorithm that might skew you towards particular situations and outcomes based on your programming and how you think and behave. So maybe you have less free will when you're acting entirely on impulse, entirely on your genetics, entirely on how you've been wired from the beginning. And maybe you get a little bit more free will, or at least the illusion of free will, when you change that mode of thinking and you become more open to each scenario being the one that could change your life. And I think that's kind of what that book was talking about, is like these specific moments that you're choosing, right? These moments of love and kindness, and you choose to seek those out, and those then alter your life forever and change your programming further because it reinforces that good behavior, right? You get good outcomes, you're going to keep doing stuff like that.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
One thing you did mention in terms of a great buzz vocabulary word and the difference between free will and determinist thought is programming. Now, I always like to think that if we're on the determinist mindset, where everything is like a giant cog in a turning machine, your brain acts that same way. I react to the environment, whether it's hot or cold, makes my brain think a certain way, and I then produce the thought, I am hot, I am cold, I should look for a sweater or a hoodie or a hat, right? But programming itself, when it gets into machines and learning machines and any sort of artificial intelligence, I would possibly ask then, if free will exists for human beings, could free will exist for machines?
I personally believe yes, but that's the big if, right? So I'm not committing to saying that we even have free will in the first place. However, if that were somehow able to be proved that, yep, humans have free will, and a lot of the time maybe people follow their instincts, and a lot of the time maybe they're not consciously making decisions, but that there are a certain sector of people that become so in tune with their own mind and aware of how it tends to bring up thoughts. I think mindfulness and meditation is a big thing to at least make you keen and aware on how it does it. You take that mentality, then maybe you can gain some control. Then why wouldn't the AI be the same, right? The AI, if all it's doing is information processing, the same way that we're information processing. I'm taking in visual stimuli. I'm taking in auditory sounds. I'm taking in my smells and the experience and touch and just feeling where I'm at, feeling the breeze. If you gave the AI that same sense of agency, then why wouldn't it also have technically its own free will at a certain point, right? So you have to get it. It can't just be an algorithm that just is reacting to things. There's something different about a truly artificial general intelligence versus just like machine learning and what we have right now with Siri and the Google Assistant, and those are certainly learning from stuff, but it's not really learning. It's not the same learning that we do.
Do you think it's because it's made of metal and not something organic?
I don't have that bias at all, so no. I don't think that has any basis. It's more of just how it's made. So the current algorithms are not at all even close to general intelligence. But if you were to take one that actually is, then I can't see that not at some point becoming sentient, although I don't believe that is required to make something generally intelligent. I think you could make something completely unconscious that also knows how to answer every question. And I think that comes down to the programming and understanding how was our brain actually programmed in the first place? What really is what gives us at least, if nothing else, the illusion of conscious thought. How could we reproduce that in an AI? And I don't think that's an inevitable thing. I think that's the hardest problem that we have when it comes to creating AI is like what gets it to go over the threshold of just taking in information and running probabilities and knowing exactly what it is, more so than how we do it. Because we technically do the same thing. We take information, we base off of probabilities of our previous experience. I'm like, oh, I know that every time I've shot this basketball, if I do it this way, I'm going to miss. That's still its own calculation. We might not think about it as robotically as the AI does, but it's kind of the same thing.
It's happening to you.
It's a happening.
Whether it's happening consciously or subconsciously, it's happening.
It's being calculated for sure.
And whether you have control over that happening, it's another question.
That's another it's another question. And that's why I don't subscribe to one or the other, because I'm willing to go as far as that of like, hey, it could be this, it could be that. But I don't want to commit to say, yeah, we definitely have free will, or no, like everything's outside of our control, because I think to some degree people need the illusion of control. People need the belief that they can control their own destiny in order for them to become the ultimate version of themselves, whether or not that was determined already or not.
Why might they need that?
I think it's because it comes from our tribal nature, right? We're used to having, like Trump, right? He's like our daddy, right?
Let's not use those words in that sequence again.
You get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Is that the reason why there's a whole sector of people that love Trump is because he represents a certain type of leader that back in the day used to, like when we were literally tribal, used to be like you'd have the guy who was, just really confident, like, oh, he seems like he knows what he's talking about. Meanwhile, he's fucking rambling about bullshit, and he has no idea what he's talking about. But it doesn't matter. You're trying to take this inherent thing of like, the patriarchy, right? Like we have this patriarchal society where it was for the most part male dominated in any position of power in our tribes. And we are still dealing with the effects of these genetics because our society has evolved much faster than our genetics have. We're still suffering from the gene issues that we have and what was previously advantageous to have as genes and now is not as much because of our technologically mediated assistance that we have now, that we're able to do things that we never could have done before. And so some of the things that are still part of our genes and part of our makeup are now hurting us. They're making us, like our selfishness and all these things that got us through the jungle are now fucking us over here in these large cities and in corporate America. So I think a lot of it really is just genetic imprints that are negatively affecting a modern society that no longer represents what those genes were initially expressed for. And I don't think it's caught up yet.
Interesting. It's almost like it is a biological detriment, right? That perhaps maybe even something that is made out of metal could surpass that sort of imprint or initial coding, that it's not flagged with flagrant needs to be selfish or have any sort of intrinsic hate, if that's even such a thing, or whether it's just taught.
I think that's taught. I think hate is taught.
Right.
I mean, find a kid, like, don't get me wrong, kids can be shitty, right? Kids can definitely be shitty to one another. I've been the victim of that for sure. But at the same time, I think it's usually learned behavior. They're seeing it happen, whether it's on TV or from their parents or even just from other kids. And they see that behavior and they replicate it. I don't think any kid is inherently evil. In fact, I think most kids are inherently just curious, They're just curious little monkeys, and they just want to know about the world around them. And depending on who's teaching and morphing their knowledge about what the world is and their perception of it, that's going to determine how they're going to approach their day-to-day activities. Get an optimist and a pessimist looking at the same situation, you're going to hear two different accounts. So it's kind of the same thing, is that I think your mind space and the way that you design how you think about things can be altered. And whether that is altered because you have agency and you're able to do it, or whether it was always going to happen that way, I do believe it can be done. So in that sense, there's some degree of free will, quote unquote, because you can consciously make the decision to be somebody else. If you don't like who you are, you really can change your mind to be someone else. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort, but it can be done. Is that free will? Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. It could completely be that you were always going to make that radical transformation, and you just needed that one situation that triggered you, because it's all just reactionary. That's possible, man. I'm not gonna commit one way or the other. But I like to believe that, at least on some level, if I decide to make something, again, assuming I even have a decision to be made, that I can kind of follow that. And if it's all predetermined, then so be it. I still had the illusion that I was able to make that decision.
Now, I have a question. Just, even take any sort of personal opinion out for the side. I kind of like asking this is, in your words, what would be the implication for the existence of free will in everyone? What would that sort of mean in our lives, how we look at our lives, how we look at each other, right? Because if I have free will and you have free will, then how do my decisions really reflect that? And what kind of a world or a sandbox would we have to live in for that to exist?
That's a good question. I think if everyone had free will, meaning true free will, then it would mean that everyone could be whatever they want it to be, truly. Certain environmental factors might limit the opportunities of how high you can reach, because there genuinely is some environmental things that prevent people from ever getting above a certain level. But theoretically, anyone could then become whatever they wanted to be, good or evil, right? We could have some super villains coming out of that world.
Ooh, real quick, just because you said environment, and I wanted to clarify this, you don't necessarily mean the environment like, oh, I grew up in a desert, or I grew up in the woods. More so social, economic values.
Everything, yeah.
Right. Would that be based on other people's free will, and maybe they subject other people's free will to some
definitely
degree?
Definitely, because think about the free will of a politician, right? The free will of a politician to ignore the will of the people, pass a bunch of legislation that's going to hurt them, directly affects everyone else's free will, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think assuming free will here, everybody's free will then thus influences everyone else's, which again limits or expands the potential outcomes of any given individual. So if I'm with my free will doing something that benefits you, I'm now expanding your opportunities. I'm giving you a new ceiling. Maybe it's a little higher than it was before, because I'm able to help you in some way that I have some expertise that you don't have, and you have some expertise that I don't have, right? We can each better each other. So my personal calculation when I'm looking for people that I either want to be friends with or want to work with or just associate with in general, I'm always looking for, is there something I can offer this person? And it doesn't mean monetarily or anything like. It's not always an exchange. Like I view it as like, do we have a good time together? Is there something that clicks? Can I help this person in some way? Give them a perspective that they don't normally hear? And are they expanding me and helping me grow? And if people aren't helping you grow, then I don't think they're good to have in your life, because everything that you do requires energy. So how you want to spend that energy and that time is entirely up to you. And if you have people that are taking energy from you and you're not getting any energy from them in return, then that's a person that you don't want to associate with. That's an energy drain. That's a time suck. And ultimately, those are the people who end up making you feel worse about yourselves. You know, rather than somebody who you outright don't like. That's easy because then you just stay away from them. But somebody who you're like, I don't know how I feel about them, or I don't know how they feel about me. Do they like me? Do they hate me? And when you feel like that, that's taking even more time and more energy than somebody who you're like, oh yeah, that guy's a prick. Fuck that guy. You know, it's way easier to just be like, all right, whatever. I'm just not going to associate with them. So I find with people that I know I don't like, I just like, bye-bye. I just don't spend any time around them. And then if there are people that I really like, then I go out of my way to make time for them. And although sometimes I feel bad because I'm like, there are people who I really like to hang out with and I like spending time with that I feel like I don't give enough time to. It's because I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to do the things that I really want to do. I have a lot of like me time, a lot of alone time that I have to spend learning things that I want to do. So when I want to find people that I think we benefit from some sort of mutual relationship of some kind, it doesn't have to be professional at all, purely just friendship, right? I just enjoy their company. Then I always want to make sure I make time for them, or at least let them know that, hey, if I don't have time, it's not because I don't like you. It's because I got all these other things going, and if I really want to accomplish these things, I got to do those things. How do you balance that yourself?
Balance what?
Giving people time to people. Yeah.
Giving people time, as if it's somewhat of a commodity.
It is. You only have so much in your lifetime. It's a finite. It's an unknown finite variable in your life.
Right. How do I balance that? I would say that it kind of comes to pain and pleasure, but almost more so whether or not if I have the ability to balance it.
Does anyone really?
If I could make time, I'd make some time, but knowing the society we live in, if I did that, I'd probably be working for it.
Yeah.
But I like to think part of it is living in like a comedy. So in terms of giving people time, it's like giving people stage time, where it's, can this person add a couple jokes, make me laugh, or do they add in situational drama and turn it from a comedy into a sitcom, like where you're always waiting for a laugh track of like 1964 recordings of people? Or is it strictly a drama, and is that something that gives the overall arc, its curvature? But in terms of balance, it sort of comes down to looking perhaps in the future, right? That you're essentially, or at least in my mind, I would be managing the time I give to others based off of how it's going to work out in the future, right? So whether it's going out to dinner with someone, did you plan that a while ago, or did you two show up at the restaurant randomly and say, hey, you're eating alone, I'm eating alone, let's sit down?
Yeah, serendipity, man.
That would be wild. But it's happened, right?
Yeah.
But managing time to give to others, I think that's kind of what my time here is for. And I mean that in the very broad sense that part of it is to give your time and energy to others. That, I may just be one person, live or die, what does it really matter? But if I'm able to make an effect on dozens or many other people more than just the singularity of one, I think that in itself is a little bit rational then.
Yeah, especially when you think about our tribal nature, going back to our genes, that we were here to serve each other, right? Oh, Johnny's really good at hunting. He's the guy who gets all of our game, and we all eat. And Mary was really good at stitching the baskets and weaving the clothes for the children. And and these again are just our roots. These are not what it has to be now, right? And so I understand we do want equality with women, and we do want it where now women don't have to just be the housewife. But hey, if a woman wants to be a housewife and that's her decision, boom, do it. If that's what you're more geared for, do the thing you're geared for. And there's a great quote forgot who said it, man. Fuck, I wish I remembered who said it. But the idea is that we need more people doing the thing that makes them come alive, because that's what the world needs, is more of that. So whatever your thing is, figure that thing out, and you serve that to other people. And by serving other people, you'll be serving your own life's purpose, thus making you feel fulfilled. Because I know for me personally, the thing that makes me feel most joyous, most fulfilled, is when I'm helping other people. Or I really like unlocking people's potential. There's something cool about that, of like being like, no, man, you can really do this. You just have to keep plugging away, but you're on the right track. And just sometimes that's what people need. They just need affirmation. Like, hey, am I doing this? Like, especially when you're doing something new and you're like paving your own way, there's no roadmap. There's no instruction manual. There are guidelines you can follow from people who are smart and who have done similar things, but no one's lived your life. No one's dealt with the situations that you've run into, the trials and tribulations. And the only way for you to navigate that is to surround yourself with people who empower you in ways to make the best decisions that you can with the information you have, which is limited. It's, you don't have all the information. So given what you know and the context in which you know it, how can you make the best decisions? Well, some people are going to be the type of person who tells you to do the wrong thing. And it's not because they're trying to make you do the wrong thing necessarily. It's just that's their impulse and that's their inclination. And their impulse and inclination could be deadly to you, if you pick the wrong people. So that's why I think it's so important to surround yourself with people that are going to better you in some way. Because then, if there is no free will, then you might as well have influences that at least are skewing you in the right direction.
I could see that. I like that too. Now, another question, just to flip it on its head, because I think we've been talking about free will a little too much. Let's go on the dark side. Let's talk
Determinism.
Mechanist philosophy. What would be the implication if none of us did have free will and every action, past, present, and future, is already determined?
Then you can't fault anyone for anything.
Speak a little bit more to that.
Well, I mean, even some of the worst people, let's take Donald Trump, for example. I like using him because he's this guy, I swear, doesn't think. And he is like a victim of circumstance in this scenario, right? If everything is predetermined, this guy was born rich, failed at everything he ever did in life, but always had money to bail him out. So he's never had to feel the responsibilities. Like you said, the quote before about a week in poverty versus a lifetime of riches. He's the epitome of that. And he's had nothing but yes men around him because of all that money and influence. So technically, you could actually not fault him at all for being the way that he is, even if he is objectively a piece of shit in a lot of ways, right? But you technically can't fault him then if everything is predetermined and he was born with these circumstances and all these influences constantly just were jerking off the ego of him. Because that's really what it is. He's got this inflated ego that's also extremely fragile. It's like super large but super fragile. And if all of this is just a product of his environment and the people around him, then can you really fault him?
Right.
And this is not a defense of Trump.
No, but it's more of a defense in the way you treat other humans.
Empathy.
Right.
Understanding where they might come from.
Forgiveness. That, I think, what you just spoke to is a great implication, is that you have to take all the events around us, perhaps all the people and the way they act towards other people, whether there's so much hate, whether there's killing, disease, famine, that perhaps if it is all supposed to be, or it is, you could say, then do you accept it? Must you accept it? If you fight against, as Hamlet put it, the slings of arrows, it's you against an arrow. You're going to lose. So do you just kind of let yourself in the water and have the waves take you away, or do you swim out to a point? But when it comes to, I think, treating other people and interacting with them, I would think that determinism in itself is almost a more human theory of existence, where since there is really no space between you and me, we're just a different assembly of molecules and atoms, and there's no space, shared consciousness, but two different points of awareness, then how could hate really ever exist between two people then? Or how can there only be just love if there is killing and, vile hatred things people may say? It kind of becomes a question of, then, let's say we can't act on it, we can only observe, then perhaps what could it try to be teaching us? All these different things that if we can't control this, then why is it still happening?
I think it comes down to perspective. It's all about how you frame it. So even if you're not in control, like I said with the optimist and the pessimist, they can see the same events unfold and have a different tale to tell. And I think it benefits most people greatly to choose the optimistic side. And I understand it's a tall order for people who their whole lives have been framed in a negative way. It's hard to deprogram that. And we certainly don't teach how to live life in schools. We don't teach that. We teach information. We teach facts, which are arguably not even facts, right? And we don't teach people how to deal with some of these questions that we're asking here today. How do you end up crafting the best life? How do you pick your friends? What should you do in these certain social situations you're going to find yourself in? These are things you're all expected to just fucking learn. You're just supposed to learn it just by living life and making mistakes. And that's fine, but there's a lot of preventative measures that we could do if we taught these kind of things in school. And the difficult part is children are not mature enough in brain development or emotional development to truly appreciate, I think, the things that we really should be teaching them. And maybe that would be different if that's how we went about it. Maybe we'd have a much different world if this is what we taught in schools, and then, we'd be teaching a higher consciousness at a very early age, and that just becomes imprinted and becomes a way of life of the next generation. That would be awesome. If that's the case, then great. I don't know that that's necessarily going to do it, though, either. It's possible we change the whole school system and we still have the same problems that we always had. It's hard to say. But I think starting it's like trying to find the beginning of a circle, right? At what point in the cycle is the beginning, and what can influence then the rest of the curvature? And to some degree, there's probably no point. Every point becomes a new point of reference. But I think there are certain points in the span of a human lifetime that is earlier than others, so we can maybe try to aim there as our beginning of the circle, even though the reality is, the beginning of that circle maybe is a few generations ago, on how those parents influence those parents who influence those, and you could go on forever, and that's useless. And that's something that Alan Watts, I know, has talked about in a bunch of his like speeches, is he's talked about like, well, you could do that forever, but the only thing that matters is now. And when it was now back then, it's the same as now is now. And the only thing that matters is now. The only thing that matters is the present moment moving forward. And although the past can inform your decisions, it's never going to change. So the only thing that matters is how you approach everything moving forward. And so that's kind of how I subscribe. Whether it's free will or determinism, I couldn't tell you. But I could tell you that at least I have the illusion that I'm making conscious decisions every day to do the things that I want to do, to set out and to hang out with the people that I want to hang out with, and to spend time and talk about the things that I want to talk about with.
Very nice.
Yeah. And so I think right there, it's pretty heady. Let's let people digest that. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one, Johnny. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
All right. Bye-bye.